Okay, so we will move on to what film scholars have often termed as the institutional narrative. That is, the most dominant form of narrative that was strengthened in America and continued to hold sway and have an influence over popular filmmaking all over the world. In order to understand the kind of storytelling pattern that developed in American cinema, which was dominant for a long period of time, we also need to understand a little bit about the notion or the term called Hollywood. Hollywood is not only a geographical area, as we commonly understand now, around Los Angeles. In fact, before 1912, filmmaking was wholly concentrated, production was wholly concentrated around New York, the East Coast, where the financial control of cinema was also exerted. Around 1911-12, production companies started moving to the West Coast in order to get access to a variety of locales necessary for various kinds of developing genres. This shift became more permanent, particularly because of the weather conditions, availability of light, availability of various kinds of locales to shoot, topography, various topography from sea to mountains to deserts, etc. And the film production business concentrated entirely in this area called Hollywood in Los Angeles, where studios were built and a more streamlined production system began with a manager to overlook that particular system. Every part of the film business compartmentalized. Each one has its own special worker, and these sets of workers would then coordinate among themselves, and this method of production was streamlined by managerial principles, and it became known as the Hollywood studio system, a kind of manufacturing center for popular cinema. But what we need to understand is that it is not only production techniques that were systematized. Also, a kind of narrative system developed out of this kind of production technique, which is to say that Hollywood not only produced films in a specifically streamlined way, well managed, well timed, etc., in order to reap maximum benefit from the market, but also it developed a certain kind of storytelling technique which became familiar worldwide and became the norm. Even if you go to a film school today, the first year will comprise of a kind of skill development for what became known as the continuity narration technique. This is exactly the technique that was held as the ideal in that particular studio system in America, and remains a norm for worldwide filmmaking worldwide as far as popular cinema is concerned. It's only very lately that some of these conventions have been broken, they have changed, a variety of other techniques have been incorporated, but for a long time, and as film scholars have pointed out, roughly from 1915, when this system became centralized and smooth, and up to 1960, which is roughly the time when the studio system collapsed owing to court cases which were suspicious and challenged the kind of monopoly of what we call mature oligopoly as a system that appeared in America during the studio's period. So roughly from 1915 to 60, and we will be talking about what kind of narrative system developed out of it. What is the product? What does the product look like? Now, in order to understand that, we have to understand that the reigning philosophy of this filmmaking process in the studio system was one of least resistance to the spectators, to give the spectators a comfortable access to the narrative world, the story world. Now, it is important to understand that the techniques developed in Hollywood for storytelling were mostly looking at giving or offering this very convenient, accessible experience, comfortable experience to the spectators. So, the pattern of editing or the pattern of viewing objects, characters, etc., or shift from one view to the other would all be dictated by the best possible access point to the story which is unfolding on screen. In other words, film scholars have often pointed out that whereas films depict space and time, and they do so autonomously in the sense that whenever you pick up a camera and record something, you record a chunk of time and a chunk of space. The way in which these space-time chunks are ordered in the Hollywood system, what we are calling the institutional system, is that they should be subservient to the narrative concerns, the storytelling concerns. To put it very simply, if I move my camera from point A to point B, I must follow the logic of a certain kind of question which may arise in the spectator's mind. So, for example, if somebody hears a sound and looks rightward, and the spectator wants to know what is it, what is the source of the sound, what is he or she looking at, the next shot that would logically follow is a point of view shot of that spectator, of that character, at the object at which he is looking, which may be a high angle shot if the object is logically at a lower level, and a low angle shot if the object is at a higher level. So this is the logic of transition of shots, the logic of framing, the logic of understanding temporality, duration in the classical system. So, what happens is that this kind of system is also called one of least resistance because it also partly remains invisible. In other words, when we see a story unfolding in a traditional popular American cinema, it appears as if we are not being made to watch anything, but it is real life unfolding in front of us. The whole philosophy or the whole technical virtuosity of the American studio system is to make this into a streamlined production system, a technique of storytelling which could give you this semblance of reality unfolding on screen on its own accord. So let's say in His Girl Friday, when she is moving from in the office in the opening sequence to meet the journalist who is her ex-husband, the camera follows her. The camera tracks as she moves across the office room, and immediately after she knocks on the door and opens the door, we suddenly find ourselves inside the room looking at her entering. Now none of us would question of how did we jump across the door and come inside. Why don't we ask this question? It is precisely because a technique that is adopted. You see, when you see the end of the first shot, you see the woman opening the door, and when you see the beginning of the second shot, you still see the woman coming through. That is, there is a continuity in action which connects both these shots, and as we expect the woman to get inside and we are inquisitive to know what is the person she is going to meet, what does he look like, we immediately see it as logically continuous. Although, as spectators, our viewing position has shifted from room A to room B in a quite a radical fashion. I mean, we have just moved across a wall. So this is a technique which avoids and the kind of abrupt sense of intervention of the cinematic apparatus into the depiction of reality, and we would it also gives you parallelly a certain idea of three-dimensionality within a two-dimensional so-called two-dimensional screen. So it is important to understand them as techniques which are aiding a certain kind of storytelling process. It is not as if these are, for example, take that very famous example of what is known as the 180-degree rule. So you have two characters A and B who are talking to each other. When you cut from character A saying this and then cut to response of character B replying, the rule is not to cross the line, that an imaginary axis which connects them. So if we draw it on board, two characters and a straight line, the camera in the shot 2 will never go across the line, because what happens when you keep the camera across the line? So in shot A, if I see the character A to the left of me and character B to the right, in shot B, if I keep the camera on the same side of the axis, they still remain in the same spatial relationship. On the other hand, in space A and space B, we have a common area, which is the background. Now, suppose we cut from somebody talking to somebody and then we cross the axis and keep the camera on the other side of the axis. Immediately what will happen is the spatial relationship will change. That is, character A, which was on the left, will come to the right, and who was on the right will come to the left. Not only this, the common area that we were recognizing as part of the background will immediately change, because that is the part of the room we wouldn't be able to see on this side of the axis. Now, what is wrong with all this? Why is this convention followed, even if it's just a norm, just an illogical norm? It is precisely because if I cut across the axis, the orientation of the spectator to the scene takes, even if a short time, a split second, our attention is diverted to recognizing the space and reorienting our sense of relationship between objects depicted in the screen, and this takes our attention away from the story content. We would tend to hear less of the dialogue and look more at the frame. This is something that is not encouraged in American cinema. In American cinema, the idea is to move you alongside the story. Give you exactly those accessible views which are best possible views in order to understand what is going on in the story world. If you have a frame which is a high angle, be rest assured that the high angle is there to give you some sense of what is going on there. It could be that the person is at a higher power position. It could also be that the high angle reveals a particular object there in the frame in the ground, which is important as a story information. In other words, a traditional popular American film of the institutional mode of, which follows the institutional mode of representation, would never use a particular angle or a kind of technique just for the sake of it, or it would not draw attention to the technique other than its function in the entire process of narration. Usually these narratives are about a set of characters whose world is depicted and a problem is introduced in that world, and the problem is driven towards resolution through conflicts between characters. So we have psychologically centered individuals with very definite goals. I want to marry this woman, want to take revenge on this particular person who, let's say, has killed my father. And a certain set of conflicts lead you towards closure, which is a resolution of the problem. So it's very important for an American movie to follow this traditional pattern. Any amount of variation can come in between to how the story but it's important to understand that the two elements, for example, the sequencing, which shots follow which shots and how they are arranged. This is what film scholar David Bordwell calls the domain of plot. And the story order, which is what we make out of what we see on screen. So, for example, when I see a person running and getting old in the due course, or when I see a shot of a person and then we see a person grown up in the same line, it may be that 30 years of story time has been skipped, but there would be a cue to the spectator through some kind of technique which will make us assume that this chunk of time has been elapsed. So again, no Hollywood film, no institutional within an institutional mode of representation, it is not encouraged to keep transitions ambiguous. Everything must be explained, unless of course there is a generic demand. A mystery thriller, for example, will not explain everything at the beginning. But usually the drive is towards proper explanation, and the drive is towards a kind of sequencing where a shot is followed. If it poses a question, the next shot will pose an answer. I say something, the cut to the person who I am speaking to, and then his comprehension of my question and his response. This is also the logic of shot arrangement. So, as scholars have pointed out, this is a kind of cinema where narrative or storytelling concerns dominate over techniques of depicting space and time. A way in which film style, that is a systematic organization of film techniques like say long shot, long take, wide angle, whatever, these techniques and the system that organizes techniques, film style is usually not foregrounded. Style becomes important insofar as it can emphasize any dimension of the story, but it will not draw attention to itself as something independent of, let's say, the story world. This is what we call an institutional mode of representation. And institutional because it sees a virtue in this kind of storytelling system. It sees a virtue because this produces a kind of a kind of product is manufactured through the system, which is very readily accessible to a wide range of audiences.